really the ground level story of how he became the nominee. Through that, and then the press, quote, and particularly the cable networks, began to realize, oh, look what we did here. But even now, in this centrist dream, there was this town hall that CNN did, where Trump was allowed to just go wild with no editing. What, you know, what does logic tell you do if your goal is to make a truthful report? Well, there's no urgency to put it on live simulcast. Edit it. Put comments and say, okay, he said this date, he didn't say that today. Edit it. A lot of these answers are basic. And so I keep coming back to this idea of truth. And what writers, journalists do. And that's really what we're all aiming for here. And it's actually the hardest thing.
Well, and I think it's also a question of sort of bearing witness, which I think is one of the things that there is, and I've always found it so interesting because there's journalism in the fact and in the whatever, and then there's something that I think that fiction does that's harder for journalism to do, which is a kind of emotional and moral exploration and stuff that's more like gaseous than fact about human behavior and about sort of the splits between our public and private selves that you can't really, in some ways, that are harder to document in journalism.
See, I think there's a basic impetus. And for a journalist, what's the most important thing a journalist or a news organization does? Back to you said there are these three networks.
Fact-checking, remember fact-checking?
No, I would start by saying, what is news?
Right.
The determination of what is news is the most basic element of the truth.
Right.
And so back to the era that you were nostalgically talking about, or as if there were nostalgia about it, we had three networks, we had Walter Cronkite.
Right.
I can make a pretty good argument that antiseptic presentation of news was kind of conventional wisdom disguised as truth.
I do agree with you. I mean, I think that it wasn't. Yeah.
So what I'm thinking and increasingly have come around to is what novelists, journalists, memoirists do is make a decision about what is truth, what is news, what is it that we're writing about, and then there is a methodology and a process of what you have to do in pursuit of the truth. There's a very ethereal discussion of.
Yeah. I mean, I always think about it sort of along the lines too of, I think I'm always writing about human behavior, and I always think what is organic and true for this person, and obviously I'm often writing about people that don't exist, okay, so I'm actually making fake people that seem dimensional, and Grace Paley, who was a wonderful writer, who's also an activist and was my teacher, used to say it has to be true for that character, which I think a lot about what is their history, what is their socioeconomic background, how did they get to this point? Because that's in all of the things, whether it's whether it's Nixon, who is like to me also the most fascinating wacko, and actually more fascinating than Trump, really. I think. I don't know, I'm curious what you think in terms of Nixon's inner workings, but.
I think Nixon is a real person who exhibits the complexities of real persona. Trump?
Is Trump more than a hamburger?
Look, I think that it's time that in the pursuit of truth, we look at questions about fascism and neo-fascism of a peculiarly American kind in this country. In terms of Trump, I think you have to raise the question of whether he's a sociopath. If we're going to look at what I know we have a couple of
Psychiatrists.
here. We could ask them later. And I think we have to be very careful about throwing around
Sure.
terms like sociopath and fascism. One of the things that seems to me the left did in the period that you've written about, in the period that I've written about during the Cold War, is that we were a little too quick to use the term fascism about people on the right, that it was inapplicable, that it was wrong. Now, and I remember the first time I did it on the air, I said that Trump represented a peculiarly American kind of neo-fascism. And in response to, but then I said, look, you got to go look at how fascism is defined. What are the essential elements of fascism? And so I think part of this question of truth is about how we describe things. But we can't just be throwing terminology around out there either.
Right. So I have so many questions for you, but one of them is, so looking at where we are now, and there's this world of, now we have these legal cases sort of pending, and there's still a world of people who agree with Trump's assertion that he won the election. What do you even do with that? Like how do you, where is the argument, where's the fight, what do you know?
I start from the belief that all of what we're talking about is not political, not journalistic, but cultural. That what we're experiencing in this country now, and one of the bad things that journalists and people in politics do is they separate politics and journalism as if they're not part of a larger culture. This is a deep cultural phenomenon. More than a phenomenon, it is defining us. What has been going on in this country for the last 20, 30, and especially 5, 10, 15 years since the first line of your book. And so Trump has ignited this cold civil war. But the conflagration, some 70, the polls, you can be off by a bit, but some 70% of the people who identify themselves as Republicans continue to embrace Trump, what he does and says.
Well, so
do they believe that the election is stolen? Most of them, both the numbers would indicate no, they don't. They don't believe it. But how do I finish the thought?
Well, I think it's how do you explain that the Republican Party that used to, in some way, when it did have a little moral thread, we thought, how does it stand by this? And does it not feel afraid in the ways that many other people feel afraid?
Well, you're talking about the Republican Party as an inanimate object.
Right, exactly.
But let's start with the inanimate object. And one of the things I think, again, we have to do is, as reporters,
and what
people
is the
interested
object?
in truth is to quantitatively and qualitatively look, and I believe the answer is demonstrable, that there has never been such a radical party in modern American history as today's. Everybody would have expected, if we're going to have a radical political party, it's sure as hell not going to be the Republican Party. Well, it is. It is a radical party such as we have never seen this kind of radicalism. Whether we agree with this kind of radicalism or don't, the party machinery, its candidates, and its constituency, the people themselves, have embraced in this book
Sorry.
a kind of radicalism that is and would have been unthinkable.
But is it like for the old school Republicans, is it now power literally at any cost, power at the sacrifice of democracy?
Well, now you get into the question of the old school Republicans, who I would call, and again, I think there's the test of truth behind this, and I'll give you an example. I did a story on the air in CNN and online saying and naming 21 Republican senators who hold in private Trump in disdain, contempt, and think he's a demagogue. And I named all 21 of them. Unheard of. But I named them because I had the information from people who worked for them, because I couldn't abrogate confidentiality of these 21 people, but I could do it, and I had the quotes, and I had it cold. And these are the great enablers. This is a tale, if you're going to look at how this phenomenon has become what it is, we have to look at enabling by the political class.
Right.
And I got a call the next day, and one of those 21 people denied what I had written, and he was lying. And I got a call the next day from a former Republican senator recently departed who said, Carl, the number is really closer to 40. It's true.
Wow.
So think what that means. If you, and some of that, I'm not a sociologist, I just know that when, and you know, the third rail that you can't talk about the history of Germany. We need to talk about the history of Germany. Because there are, I'm not talking about Trump, Hitler / I'm talking about similarities of historical precedent and existential reality. We need to talk about where Germany was, where inflation was, what the circumstances were, etc., and how could it be that a country of civilized, in quote, how did this phenomenon come to be? That through enablers, through whatever, that basically half of the adults of voting age in this country are willing to embrace this demagogue. And demagogue doesn't even begin, and what he's saying represents, and what some of the big guy here is contemplating. How did the unthinkable become the contemplative norm? I think all of this is what's going on. And so that we have, as novelists, as journalists, a responsibility to look at these questions, and you start by doing the work of what is the real existential truth at this moment, and then how did we get there? But if we can't agree based on fact and a string of facts, context is a huge part of the best obtainable version of the truth. But if we can't start to do better, now we get into one thing that you do have some in here about social media, about the precursor of social media. So a few moments ago we were talking about, look, people, consumers of news are looking for information to reinforce what they already believe. That's a huge difference. Look, I can't quantify that, but a huge difference from the time of Watergate. Remember that 60–70% of people thought Nixon should stay in office until the tapes.
Right.
But then, the evidence was there. Republicans were responsible, are the heroes of Watergate. They're the ones on the House Judiciary, on the Senate Watergate Committee, who voted for that report, who said, what did the president know, when did he know it? Then the House Judiciary Committee, courageous Republicans voted for articles of impeachment. Where did that happen this time around?
And the broadcast of those hearings. I mean, that was also the first time.
Well, we also had
you know,
the broadcast of the January 6th hearings,
Right.
which are 3 great series of hearings in modern American
Yeah.
history. Army McCarthy, Watergate, January 6th. Those hearings, that committee did in a few months what it took the Watergate committee a couple of years to do. So, anyway, I think we need to hear a little bit from some questions from the audience.
Great.
And what a pleasure it's been to be up here.
I know, questions, and also I want to ask Carl, ultimately, like, okay, so I write about like how we got here. I want to know, now where are we going, Carl? But yeah, we have questions. Yes, please.
Yes.
Patty McCormick.
Thank you both very much. I'm also one of those people who became a writer in part because of the way I was inspired by your work. The topic of this can't happen here. Right now, as AM knows, one of the things that I'm deeply involved in with my work is book banning. My books are being banned all over the country, and I'd like to hear you guys talk about the importance of books in our cultural and political world. And maybe some context when you talk about that Cold War that's been ignited. Where does book banning come into play? And what were the roots? Book banning.
I'm going to try this first.
Sure, yeah, please do.
Repeat the question.
Could y'all not hear? The question was about book banning. Patty was saying her books are on, there's an amazing piece that just went up in the Atlantic about 183,000 titles that are entered into the AI equation. But whatever the case, this can't happen here. Book banning of the greatest books, among the greatest books in our history, Mark Twain. But they don't have to be the greatest books in our history. The idea that at this point in our history in this country, that book banning would become the order of the day and part of the arsenal of this cohort. How big is this cohort? It's a cohort that's damn near half the country from what we can see. How do you begin to, I think we're talking about what has happening to democracy in this country. And also it's not just this country. You know, what's the most important story in the world today, I think, that, as a journalist, that I would say it's the pendulum swinging against democracy.
See, I feel like the pendulum is going like this. You know, because I think it's interesting in the sense that, to me, I look at book banning and I think it's about control, social control, and preventing thinking. So it's like we ban a book, we say you can't teach that, you can't talk about that, you will be fired, you will be put under arrest. If you take someone to a clinic for a medical procedure, you are under threat. So it's about controlling society at the same time as we have, you know, computers and cell phones and things that can put us in touch instantaneously around the world. So we have faster communication and much broader communication, which is completely the opposite end of shutting down thought and control. And so we've got this weird world going constantly that's super complicated. And I would say we don't have a good handle on it, no pun intended.
Well, I think the other part of the equation, Patty, that we need to look at is that the woke component is not a right-wing trope. It's for real. It's as anti-democratic as banning books in its way. And it is part of this cultural stew that we've got to be looking at. and it's for real. It's a horror. And as it figures in the democracy equation, I'm not about to say that there is an equal anti-democratic, lowercase, movement of equal danger left and right, but this particular element figures huge in all kinds of equations that also makes it much easier for the rightist anti-democratic impetus to thrive.
I also think there's an element of it too and it goes back to you sort of saying that in a way the ending of the book or pieces of it are sort of ambiguous in terms of not saying believe this or think this. I think for me what's always important too is we have to be able to talk to each other. We have to, whether we agree or disagree, we have to listen, we have to respect other opinions. And as soon as we start saying, you're not allowed to say that, on whatever side of woke or not, or I'm canceling you, all of a sudden we're not having conversations and we're not talking about history, and we can't avoid repeating history if we start erasing history and saying that didn't happen, or we start rewriting books and that kind of stuff. So I think it's a very dangerous, on both extremes in a way, a really dangerous predicament where all of a sudden people are afraid to talk about things, are afraid to try and think, I may not get it right, but I'm going to make the effort to listen and be active in this. And people are like, no, I don't even want to do that, because you put yourself at risk, literally, I think is what we're seeing. And even people who are like election monitors, we didn't ever think of that as particularly politicized. Now we have people testifying that they are under physical threat for doing a civic duty. And librarians, I mean, not to be weird, but like whoever thought of a librarian as like a political figure? Like, you're a librarian.
Next question.
Good right here.
I watched the part of the Second Republican debate the other night, and I'm curious if you thought that the moderators really lost control or deliberately lost control, because it was just such a mess, and maybe for some people it made good television, but I remember when debates were orally affairs.
I was at a Writers Guild event because I sit on their council, so I didn't even get to see it. Carl, did you get to see it?
I saw it. I thought the whole thing was a train wreck. I thought the moderators were terrible. I thought that the candidates were by and large terrible. I thought the set was terrible. And actually the Reagan Library is a really fascinating place. And anyway, no, I agree with your question.
I think we had the gentleman in the back, and then we'll go together.
Thank you for being here, providing some very provocative thoughts. As a writer, generally provides answers if you can, and a great writer provides great answers. If you were writing our Constitution, and I'm sure you've thought about it for quite a while, and there were 2 or 3 things that you would change that might help the polarity that we experience. What might they be, and why?
Carl, that one's for you, I think.
Well, I think you raised a great question, because I think in our reverence for the Constitution, it's a nostalgic reverence about a document that we need to look at much more realistically, because it doesn't work nearly as well as our reverence would have it be. We're a young country. 300 something years, 400. We're the oldest democracy in the world. Our democratic institutions and our democratic constitution are not working. And some of the newer democracies, although everybody's having many of the cultural problems that we're talking about, our mechanisms are particularly antiquated. I'll get to the Constitution in a second, but let's just look at a government shutdown. What? The-
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Come
We don't
on.
say that in church.
Come on. What? How could this? And we sit here and accept it and say, oh yeah, that's the way things are. What kind of democratic institution would allow this kind of ridiculous, insane monkey wrench to be a part of the system? But now let's look at you asked about the Constitution. We have a system of election that is insane. We are about to have an election for the President of the United States that's going to be decided by people in 8 states. The rest of the country, back to that word I can't use in the church.
So, like Australia, every adult should have to vote. It should be a
Come on,
requirement
what?
that everybody votes and every vote
I
counts.
mean, how in the world? That would be you'd think that would be a starting point, except our Constitution says you need 3/4 of the states to ratify a constitutional amendment. There is only one way a constitutional amendment in this country today could be ratified, and that would be from a far right-wing amendment, some of which are being proposed to further consolidate undemocratic methodology into our system. We're in a terrible place constitutionally. I mean, the Second Amendment, that piece of insanity, how in the world could a series of Supreme Courts uphold the idea, given the very basic notion of judicial review, et cetera, and precedent, the idea that a line about militias means that everybody can go around and you can't regulate weapons? That's my answer to all of that.
I would just say, I have 3. One is that everybody has to vote. 2 is that I think that the notion of these founding fathers, they forgot some people in the beginning, and I think they should all be put in from the beginning, like women and other people, in terms of how things work. And yeah, and there's some technical difficulties that need, you know. Yeah, let's go back and read the people over here. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that Trump does that's absolutely brilliant is he is being tried in all these court cases. And he will find a phrase to save him. And the phrase now is witch hunt. And he gets away with it. And I'm wondering why the press and journalists do not say it is not a witch hunt.
First of all, I think the press does say and demonstrate that this is not a witch hunt. And I don't quite agree with that. And I don't think that his uttering the phrase witch hunt, it's part of a vast arsenal that he not only commands, but that his particular evil brilliance and genius is to have a cliche finger on the pulse of many things going on in this country and about the people of this country from his own experience in part. We're also talking, put aside a sociopathic question. We're talking about somebody who has lived a criminal life his whole life. Fact. Whether or not he's convicted in a court of law, this has been a criminal life, a way of life, of escaping the law, of hiring and using Roy Cohn as a teacher and a lawyer. So it's not about simply Trump uttering the word